Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by Angela Constance on response to Storm Éowyn. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to update Parliament on the exceptional weather Scotland experienced last week during Storm Éowyn. I would like to begin by expressing condolences to the families and friends of those who have died or been injured as a result of incidents during this storm. I would also like to extend my sympathy to those who have experienced disruption or damage to their businesses and homes as a consequence of the storm. On Tuesday, the 21st of January, the Met Office announced the likely arrival of Storm Éowyn, predicting disruption on Friday and Saturday. By Thursday, the 23rd of January, forecast confidence increased and the Met Office took the serious step of issuing a red warning for wind, covering the Central Belt and southern Scotland. Red weather warnings are issued very rarely and signify not only the high likelihood of severe damage and disruption, but also a significant threat to life. Amber warnings for wind also covered the remainder of the country, underlining the scale of the high winds. The Scottish Government and frontline agencies across Scotland took this threat extremely seriously. Emergency planning and resilience structures were activated across Scotland, including the Scottish Government Resilience Room and the Transport Scotland Resilience Room. Scotland's responders, including emergency services, local authorities and utility companies, quickly mobilised staff to respond to the impacts of the storm. Ministerial meetings of the Scottish Government Resilience Room were held daily from Thursday to Monday, and Cabinet discussed this morning. Ministers continue to receive regular updates on the incident recovery, including restoration of power and the recovery of transport services. On Saturday, the 25th of January, the First Minister also joined a ministerial COBRA meeting to discuss the impacts of Storm Éowyn across the UK. Public advice was issued to support the public in planning for the storm and taking steps to stay safe. Police Scotland issued clear advice to the public not to travel during the storm. We worked quickly with the Met Office, the UK Government and the Northern Ireland Executive to activate the new emergency alerts capability for the first time in Scotland since its launch, and also activated the Scottish Government's Ready Scotland marketing campaign. I am grateful to both the Met Office and Police Scotland for issuing those early and clear warnings, and to the public, who, in following this advice, helped to significantly mitigate the damage which the storm might otherwise have caused. Put simply, by following guidance to stay at home, people have prevented further loss of life. However, no amount of warning could prevent significant damage and disruption from a storm of this scale. Éowyn, as with other recent weather events at home and abroad, are symptoms of the warming world to which we are now adapting. I echo the First Minister's comments over the weekend that the veracity of climate change is with us. We also know these trends are locked in. To prepare people for this challenge this changing climate, we must bring climate resilience to the heart of decision-making across the nation. The Met Office have called Storm Éowyn probably the strongest storm to hit the UK for a decade. With gusts of wind exceeding 100 miles per hour, the entirety of Scotland was covered by weather warnings on Friday, and we saw widespread impacts across the country. 92% of the school estate in Scotland was closed, and all rail, bus and ferry services were cancelled. There were significant impacts across the road network, including fallen trees, power cables, overturned HGVs, as well as road traffic collisions. However, Transport Scotland report that during the red alert period, traffic volumes dropped by 80%. The public listened to and followed the important advice issued by Police Scotland. At its worst, over 130,000 people were reported to be without power. The weather itself meant that it was not always safe to carry out repairs, and frontline agencies established a number of welfare centres to support the most vulnerable. As of the latest update at noon today, 2,538 customers remain off power. Throughout this response, our health and social care partnerships worked hard, hand in hand, with the utility companies to support the most vulnerable individuals, targeting resources to reinstate power to care homes and vulnerable individuals as soon as possible. I would like to thank them for their ongoing efforts and recognise the people in our communities who came together to support vulnerable friends, family and neighbours. The trunk road and motorway network has fully recovered following Storm Éowyn. However, there is a risk of secondary impacts around weakened trees that may come down and debris, and that may still get into the drainage systems, which can lead to further localised disruption until the clear-up is complete. Health and social care services were impacted, with non-essential care packages suspended during the red warning and some non-urgent patient appointments cancelled on Friday, which are being rescheduled. However, thanks to the excellent work and dedication of staff providing health, social care and social work services in our hospitals and communities, as well as the efforts of unpaid carers, the third and independent sectors, there was no significant impact on patient care and services are returning to normal. Forth Valley Royal Hospital was subject to a storm-related power outage on Friday afternoon and was without mains power for approximately 1 hour. Thanks to the efforts of the Health Board and the Power Company, this was quickly resolved and no patient harm was identified. But we are still in the process of recovery, and the impacts of this storm continue to be felt, and indeed may continue to be felt in the coming days and weeks. Over 2,500 customers in Scotland remain without power, and while power companies are working hard towards restoration, the extreme damage caused by Storm Éowyn means that this task is very complex. Whilst in the early period of recovery, power companies were able to make quick wins and restore thousands of customers at a time, they are now dealing with some of the most challenging and remote issues. Recovery operations have continued on the rail network as Scotland's Railway recovers from over 500 incidents associated with the storm. ScotRail and Network Rail are working to reopen lines as quickly and safely as possible, with services being reinstated overnight on the lines to Ayr, Balloch and Paisley Canal. By tomorrow, it is anticipated that the lines to Largs, Weems Bay and Gourock will also be reopened, and the landslip at Hamilton cleared services resumed to Lark Hall. 73% of services were operating earlier today, with this increasing as routes reopen. Many schools suffered damage to infrastructure to varying degrees, as well as a loss of power. However, 99% of schools across Scotland were able to reopen as usual yesterday. Remedial works are ongoing in 16 schools, and 6 local authority early learning and childcare settings remain closed this morning. I do not underestimate the impact that these disruptions have had on families and staff. Presiding Officer, this has been and continues to be an extremely complex and protracted incident. Every business, home and individual was affected by an amber or red weather warning, and I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the organisations and individuals who are working tirelessly to restore normality to people's homes and lives. And I wish to close by paying tribute to the work undertaken by our responder and voluntary organisations to protect the public from emergencies such as this. We must continue to work together to ensure Scotland remains prepared to withstand future storms which come our way.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business, and I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. I also want to put on record our sympathy with those who have lost a loved one or been injured as a result of the storm.
Mr Carson, if you might just wait a moment. Okay. My apologies. Do continue.
Storm Irwin is leaving a profound impact on our communities, particularly in rural areas. Rural areas which merited little or no mention in the government statement, which is sadly what us in rural areas have come to expect. The storm caused unprecedented damage, leaving thousands without power, water and essential services. I also want to thank the support that SPEN, the Scottish Power Energy Networks, have given me and colleagues across the Chamber in helping to support the most vulnerable in our communities. We know we've gone from over 200,000 households off electricity at the peak to under 1,000 today. And I know their engineers are pushing really hard to get as many, if not all, back on today. It's a fantastic effort from engineers from across the UK working in very challenging conditions. Much of the impact, which equates to 100 days of damage in less than 3 days, was in my constituency in across Dumfries and Galloway, where over 51,000 homes were without power. I want to thank the local authority, police and emergency services and for the amazing work that groups of volunteer resilience workers like Hazel Smith and our team in Whithorn and what they have done to ensure the safety of everyone in the most badly affected areas. One of the most critical issues has been the disruption of digital and mobile phone services. In many rural areas, the storm has crippled telecommunications, leaving residents isolated and unable to communicate with emergency services or loved ones. The inadequacies of the failings of the new digital voice service needs to be urgently reviewed. It's highlighted the urgent need for investment in more resilient telecommunications infrastructure to ensure that our communities remain connected even in the face of severe weather events. The storm has disproportionately affected vulnerable people in rural areas, with reports of elderly residents and those with disabilities being left cold in homes without electricity or support. Indeed, the lack of power has also impacted on farms and people with private water supplies. So these rural communities are in desperate need of immediate assistance. Will the Government commit to prioritise the restoration of mobile phones and telephone services and to provide additional resources to support our most vulnerable citizens to build more resilient and inclusive community for the violent and frequent storms which are inevitable in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Mr Carson for his questions, and can I emphasise that the whole purpose of having resilient structures and indeed our focus on recovery is both to, one, focus on the most populated areas, but not just the Central Belt. And I can assure him that in terms of the 6 ministerial SCOR meetings that took place over the weekend, we had substantial and in-depth discussions about the challenges faced with our rural communities. And in terms of the issues that he raises in and around utilities, I'm acutely conscious that the Scottish Southern Electricity Network is working very hard in the Kintyre area. There are particular challenges in Dunoon, Ballure to Clachan villages, from south of Tarbert, and of course our island communities, whether that's Gia or Isla. And I know that the Transport Secretary was particularly focused on the resumption of ferry services, which may not be without complete disruption, but the resumption of those ferry services was very much with the necessity and needs of our island communities. And can I also say that I appreciate his thanks to the Scottish Power Energy Network, because they have had particular challenges. They cover a wide geographical area in Scotland, from Dumfries and Galloway through Ayrshire, Central and Fife, and pockets. They have pockets of licence area right across central Scotland, and they have had to deal with the challenge of 1,000 fault. So they have made remarkable progress. Nonetheless, I very much appreciate, because I've got constituency experience of this myself, that if you are one of those remaining 2,500, it will be of small comfort, bearing in mind we are now several days into the impacts. In terms of the points about telecommunications, that is of fundamental importance and actually a very important issue. He will, of course, be aware that telecommunications, including security and resilience of the networks, is reserved to the UK Government. The Scottish Government, of course, will continue to work very closely with the UK Government, Ofcom and the telecoms industry as a whole. I answered an oral parliamentary question last year to Ariana Burgess on this very subject, where she raised issues in and around Arran and concerns there, and Skye and the other parts of the Highlands and Islands. And whilst the telecoms industry has made a decision to replace the traditional landline telephone service with a digital service by the start of 2027, there will be no change to the statutory responsibilities that apply to the telecommunication providers. I did write in detail to Ms Burgess, and I'd be more than happy to write to Mr Carson on this point as well.
Claire Baker.
Presiding Officer, please accept my apologies for the delay in taking my place this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement, and also say that my thoughts are with those families who have experienced bereavement and injuries during this period. Storm Ailwyn has caused significant damage, and households, businesses and local authorities are beginning the recovery. However, we still have homes in Fife without power, and people are frustrated over the lack of definitive information on when they are getting reconnected. In the Resilience Room meetings, what assurances are the energy companies giving the Government, and is the Cabinet Secretary confident that communications, in the broadest terms, not just telecoms, with customers is the best it can be? The Government must also reflect on whether the advice was sufficient. What advice was given to businesses? Does the Government know, for example, how many businesses have a severe weather policy in place that STUC are saying the majority do not? On Friday morning, the Government said, stay indoors if you can, it is unsafe to drive in these conditions, and yet some businesses were still open and employees were still expected to go to work. Should the stay-at-home advice have been given earlier, and should it have been more unequivocal given the extent of the storm?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in terms of the red warning and the stay-at-home advice, I outlined in my statement to Parliament that in terms of the weather warning that emerged at the start of last week, it certainly was not at that stage predicting the scale and severity of the storm that we all ended up having to endure. But as soon as that information was available from the Met Office, Police Scotland worked very hard with Met Office and, of course, with Resilience Partners and Scottish Government too, to ensure that we worked with partners across the UK to get that red alert. So I do refute any suggestion that the red warning could have been issued any earlier, and I welcome the fact that for the first time the red alert was issued over the applicable and registered mobile phones. In terms of communications, I think, to be frank, we should always review the standard and quality of communications, whether that's in terms of government or between partners, or indeed to members of the public. I am very aware, though, that many colleagues, and I have written 3 times now to all MSPs, that some of the feedback I have had is indeed in relation to people's frustrations over some of their constituents that are still without power. But there is also a positive reflection that since Storm Arwen there has been much learning and much improved communications from utility companies in particular. In terms of the point about businesses, can I assure that the whole purpose of SCORE is to, where we need to communicate or have follow-up discussions with particular businesses or particular sectors, whether that is with retail supermarkets, road haulage, for example, because there were concerns around businesses, and all employers at the end of the day have a duty of care to their employees, and I and the Government are very clear about that. But if I can reassure the Member, Presiding Officer and Chamber that, as with all storms and major resilience operations, that we will go through a lessons learned operation, and I will convene meetings with partners to review and reflect, and will indeed take the issues to Cabinet also.
Thank you. There's great interest in the statement, as you would expect. I'd be grateful for concise questions and responses to enable me to ensure as many members can put a question as possible. I call Emma Harper, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Wigtonshire and other parts of D&G was particularly hard hit by excessively high gale force winds during the storm, with communities, including in the Machars, being left without power, including up to yesterday. And the storm closed the entirety of the A75 and impacted key infrastructure. So I thank the emergency responders, including D&G Council and SPEN teams, for their efforts to support local residents. I'm interested to hear from the Cabinet Secretary if she can set out what further action can be taken in rural areas, particularly for people who have electrical medical requirements.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do, of course, appreciate the members' interest and champion of the particular issues that Dumfries and Galloway and Wigtonshire have had to endure. She is right to reflect on the impacts on the A75, but of course the motorway network and the trunk network is, I'm pleased to say, now operational. We do have to be alert to those secondary impacts that I mentioned in my statement. In terms of members of the public, households who are relying on electrical medical equipment, it is the job of Health and Social Care Partnerships, in collaboration with utility companies, to ensure that all of those in that category are registered on the Priority Services Register, because those customers are of the utmost priority in terms of power outages, either in terms of restoration or in terms of access to generators or accommodation or other bespoke solutions.
Thank you. Jamie Green, to be followed by Elena Whittam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I pay particular condolences to the family of young Callum Carmichael from East Ayrshire, who was tragically killed during the storm. I can't imagine the pain that his family must be experiencing at the moment, and I'm sure the whole Chamber will share my thoughts on that. The west of Scotland was hit particularly hard by this storm. I'm sure we've all seen the viral video of Helensburgh Leisure Centre's roof. But that's really how bad things were. I'm relieved that some services are coming back to normal, that, for example, rail services to Largs, Gourock and Weems Bay will reopen tomorrow or the day after, I believe. It's unclear, however, if services to Ardrossan will reopen. I perhaps could ask that first of all. But given the extensive damage to many public buildings, my particular question to the Cabinet Secretary is if the Government has had any conversation with COSLA regarding any particular support packages that it could offer local councils as it seeks to repair and reopen many of these vital public services.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm sure we all across the Chamber share the condolences that Mr Green has expressed regarding the loss of Callum Carmichael, who was only 19 years old, who lost his life in a road traffic accident associated with the storm. And given his status as a student in one of the West Coast colleges, the Education Secretary certainly led condolences at Cabinet this morning. In terms of Mr Green's point about Ardrossan, that is a wider point about provision and not storm-related, but I will ask the Transport Secretary to provide him with more information. And in terms of across the public sector, whether that is local government, Scottish Government, ScotRail, Network Rail, everyone right now is assessing the cost of that damage. But the priority right now remains our people and those 2,500 people that are offline. That is the focus. Once we have served our people, we will then all have to count the cost and work through that cost collectively.
Thank you. Elena Whittam, to be followed by Colin Smith.
My heart goes out to Mr Carmichael's family, who are my constituents. What powers does the Scottish Government have to compel employers to take action earlier to close businesses once a red weather warning has been announced, noting that such warnings are rare and where dangerous weather and threat to life is predicted?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, bearing in mind that employment law is reserved, I would suggest that our powers are somewhat limited, but I absolutely do not want to, at this point in time, get into a dispute that is in any way political or constitutional, given that the focus right now is on recovery and addressing the impacts here and now that are continuing with this storm. The member, however, raises a very important point that was touched on by Ms Baker also. But it is important that we do everything that we can to scrutinise and support employers to ensure that they have the right information to be timorously passing that information on to their employees, and of course they have a duty of care. What I would say is that part of our learning the lessons review of any major event is always looking at things like civil contingencies. Many of those powers, lie at a very localised level. There are also other issues about how best do we engage, educate, encourage, but also enforce where necessary. And there are various partners that have powers in and around that, because sometimes it's not just employers who do not follow advice. It can, of course, be individuals who are to all appearances, of sound mind. But the plea that I would make is that whether you're an individual or an employer, if you don't follow advice, you not only put yourself at risk, but if you get in danger, that then becomes a rescue operation, and you, through your reckless actions, put the lives of emergency workers and volunteers at risk, and that is utterly unacceptable.
Absolutely. Colin Smith, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I echo the condolences for those who have lost their lives during Storm Éowyn? The tragic death of 19-year-old Callum Carmichael from Auckland will be utterly devastating for his loved ones. Well, Police Scotland urged people not to travel during the storm, and I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary has said that traffic volumes did drop by 80%. As we heard from other members, it is clear that some businesses still put an expectation on their employees that they were expected to come to work even when that work was far from urgent. So will the Government review the approach when it comes to travel advice when we have a severe red weather warning? You only have to look at the pictures of the HGVs lying at the side of our roads during the storm to see that advisory messages haven't gone far enough and have not been adequate enough to keep workers safe. And should we be considering whether that advice is actually more statutory and compulsory in such circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I would contend that the red travel warning was very clear. I don't think it could have been clearer. Nonetheless, we always have to have an open mind with respect to reviews. I won't repeat what I've said earlier in two previous answers in and around employers. There is some really informative data around the public's compliance with not travelling. There is significant data and reductions in the volume of traffic, whether in some roads 95%, 100%, 90% that we can share with the member. But I would reiterate that the public largely and overwhelmingly complied with this advice, but we will pick up on the other issues that members have raised today.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if there are any lessons from the storm practices of other countries who are more familiar, perhaps as a norm, with this type of weather that could benefit us here in Scotland? And how is the Scottish Government seeking to inform its practice from the experience of these other countries?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, that's perhaps an issue for slower time, but just for brevity, can I reassure Mr McGregor that our openness to learning from other countries, I would hope, would be very apparent. There are obviously other countries that experience significant snowfall with great regularity. I myself, a number of years ago, was in Japan at the time of a typhoon, and it was somewhat instrumental to see how the Japanese government dealt with that very quick emergency and how quickly they recovered. So international experience is, of course, imperative, and we are open-minded and take with all seriousness the lessons that we can learn from others.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank emergency services and offer condolences to those who lost a loved one during the storm. It was a relief to hear, though, from the Cabinet Secretary that no patients were harmed at Forth Valley Royal Hospital during the power outage. I understand that the backup generator failed, but the emergency battery that was the last resort, of course, has limited capacity. I understand it only had up to 90 minutes of power. And given that there would have been patients undergoing surgery and those that were in critical care at the hospital at that time, is she satisfied that health boards are really putting in the resilience measures that are needed to deal with a storm like this going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Mr Ruskell for his question. Can I reassure him that there is a full investigation ongoing to this incident, and it will be reported, and we will, of course, share with the relevant authorities and, of course, with Parliament about what that tells us and the action that flows from that.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Of course, I want to start by sharing the thanks of the Chamber to emergency services and expressing condolences to the families of the bereaved. Many in this chamber, as we heard, received a very loud telephone alarm, and that was received right across the Central Belt to good effect. In fact, it seems to have gone much better than the national test, which had a much smaller percentage of people reached. How is the government reviewing the success of the recent national alert sent to mobile phones? How are they going to ensure that everyone receives it in future, including those who don't perhaps have a smartphone or compatible technology? And what provision are they making for those who would wish to opt out of the alert, particularly victims of domestic violence who may have need to conceal a secret second phone? Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, they are very important points made by Mr Cole-Hamilton. I would, of course, reiterate what I've said earlier on the necessity and the effectiveness of the red alert. It is, of course, important that we review our response overall. The red alert, of course, is part of that. We will seek to do that in partnership with others across the UK, particularly around widening the scope. But the point about domestic violence, if people have a phone that's there for emergency uses and for their safety, is a point well made. It certainly has featured in discussions before, but I will get back to Mr Cole-Hamilton on the detail of that.
Call Christine Graham, to be followed by Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too offer my condolences and thank all the emergency services. Storm damage has left many in need of urgent repairs, often to roofing. Now, I have no doubt that most roofers are decent, that there are unscrupulous opportunists who will prey on the elderly, especially those living alone, something I experienced myself this weekend, being elderly and living alone, though thankfully I saw through what I consider was at best not trustworthy. Can I ask if the Cabinet Secretary will take this opportunity to alert all who may be vulnerable and desperate for repairs, who don't already know the tradesman, just to be wary and, if possible, to check with friends and neighbours before they part with any cash?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Christine Graham raises a good point and gives out some very valuable advice. I will give her the undertaking that I will raise this issue with Trading Standards and so that we can discuss with our local partners to ensure and perhaps even connect it with some of the resilience recovery work to ensure that vulnerable people are given relevant advice about any opportunistic criminals that may be circulating in communities.
Tess White, to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, this was another storm which wreaked havoc across our energy networks. With wind speeds of 90 miles an hour, the conditions were far too treacherous for engineers to carry out vital repairs. The same thing happened after storms Arwen, Babette and others. My question is, does the Cabinet Secretary, who in her statement today talked about power cables overturning, agree that this costly and dangerous disruption to the power supply bolsters the need for transmission lines to go offshore or underground? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do appreciate Tess White's question. I think that's probably a debate for another day. She will appreciate that as Cabinet Secretary for Home Affairs, who has responsibility for the resilience response, that my overview and portfolio interest in this is the emergency response. There are, of course, broader issues always to debate about how we improve our overall resilience.
Thank you. I call Michelle Thompson, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I note the question and answer already given regarding Forth Valley Royal Hospital, and I'm pleased that a full investigation is underway. There still appear, however, to be conflicting reports as to the exact length of time that the generators were offline, varying from a short period of time noted in the original statement to the hour outlined by the Cabinet Secretary. Will the investigation establish the exact length of time, as some anecdotal reports suggest that it was closer to 2 hours?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I will, of course, discuss with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care so that we can provide the member with the assurances of the breadth and depth of the investigation that will take place. And I will also ask Mr Gray in the interim to write to the member as well.
Annabel Ewing.
Presiding Officer, some 80 mainly elderly people in Fordell Gardens in my Cowdenbeath constituency were left without information or support for more than 2 days after they lost power on Friday. As Park Home residents with a unique contractual status, they were simply abandoned. Will the Cabinet Secretary agree to take this up with Scottish Power Energy Networks and with Fife Council to ensure that this Dickensian approach to people in need does not happen again?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I, like other members in this chamber, are well aware of the arrangements in and around the operation of Park Homes and some of the particular challenges that Park Homes residents experience, and I will give her that assurance that I will indeed take that matter away for both the energy companies and actually other local authorities, because we have many Park Home residential sites across the country who by and large are populated by people who are over 55 and sometimes quite elderly and at the latter stages of their lives. There is a particular uniqueness to these communities, and we must make sure that they are served and protected, and also that they are appropriately registered on the PSR in terms of utility companies.
Katie Clark.
Postal workers, many hospitality workers and other private sector workers were told they had to take unpaid leave on Friday. The public sector seems to have adopted a very different approach. Will the Scottish Government be looking at its Fair Work agenda to see if more can be done to protect workers in these emergency situations where there is a risk to life?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, the Government always looks at its Fair Work agenda because it has to permeate through all portfolios and all of our actions. Of course, some of the issues and problems that Ms Clark highlights do very much relate to employment law and employment rights. And I think it is very regretful that any barrier has been put in an individual's way to adhere to the very clear advice that was given by Police Scotland and the Met Office.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement on the response to Storm Éowyn. I'll allow a moment or two for front benches to reorganise.